There are nights that belong entirely to other people, to the audience, to the applause, to the response of a room full of strangers who have decided, together, that what they are witnessing is extraordinary. George Carlin had lived inside many of those nights. He knew their texture and their weight. But there is a different kind of night that belongs only to the person who made the thing. The night when the audience is gone and the lights are down, and the person who built the work sits alone with it for the first time and tries to understand whether it is actually what they meant. After Jammin in New York was finished, after the performance was recorded, edited, prepared for broadcast, and delivered to HBO in what became one of the most celebrated comedy specials of the 1990s, George Carlin sat in a screening room and watched it. Alone. In the dark. With no one to tell him what to feel about it. What he felt during that screening he never described in full. He spoke about Jammin in New York over the years in interviews and conversations, spoke about it with the kind of careful qualification he applied to anything he considered his best work, acknowledging its quality without entirely accepting the praise that surrounded it, always measuring it against some internal standard that remained slightly out of reach. But the night of the screening, the night when it was finished and he sat alone with it, he never described. It existed in the private ledger of the moments he kept for himself, and in that space it holds a particular kind of meaning. The meaning of a man who had spent 4 decades making comedy, sitting quietly with the thing that may have been the most complete expression of everything he had been working toward, trying to decide whether it was enough. The private screening of a finished work is a different kind of experience than any other in a performer's or artist's life. It has a quality that public reception cannot replicate, cannot even approximate. Because in public reception, the work is always filtered through the responses of other people, through applause and reviews, and the reactions of colleagues, and the gradual accumulation of what the culture decides the work means. In the private screening room, there is none of that. There is only the work and the person who made it, and the gap, or the absence of a gap, between what the person meant and what the work actually contains. Carlin had been thinking about that gap for his entire career. He had pursued it in the recording studio, stopping sessions until the performance on tape matched the performance in his head. He had pursued it in the writing process, rewriting material long after it was already working by any external standard, because it was not yet right by the internal standard that only he was applying. He had pursued it in performance, adjusting material show after show based on a response he was calibrating not to the audience's laughter, but to the quality of his own attention to the material. In the screening room, watching Jammin in New York, he was facing a version of that question that could no longer be adjusted. The work was finished. What was on the screen was what existed. The question was simply whether it was what he had meant, not whether he had done his best, not whether the audience had responded, not whether the critics would praise it, whether the thing on the screen was, at its core, the thing he had actually been trying to make. For most artists, that question produces a version of dissatisfaction, the recognition of the gap between the intention and the execution, the things that almost worked, the things that worked but could have worked better. For most artists, the private screening of a finished work is, at some level, a kind of grief for the version that was imagined rather than the version that was made. Carlin sat in the dark. The special played. He watched himself on the screen. The particular quality of his own attention in that performance, the command of the language, the precision of the construction, the specific moments when the material had found the edge it had been reaching for. He did not take notes. He did not stop the projection. He simply watched, and what he was measuring, in the dark, in the private space of his own attention, was something no one else in the world could have measured for him. By 1992, when Jammin in New York was recorded at the Paramount Theater in New York City, George Carlin had been performing stand-up comedy for more than 30 years. He had built and dismantled and rebuilt his public persona at least twice. He had gone from clean-cut television comedian to counterculture provocateur to the dark, precise, all-black-wearing social critic who commanded stages in the 1980s and 1990s with an authority that few performers in any medium could replicate. He had also, in the years leading up to Jammin in New York, survived things that might have ended the careers of performers with less commitment to the work. The personal turbulence of the 1970s, the health challenges, the financial pressures of a career that had been remade rather than simply sustained. Each time he had come back to the stage, not with a different material, not with a more commercial version of what he did, but with the same work, pushed further, refined more completely, more certain of what it was trying to do. The material in Jammin in New York was the most uncompromising thing he had yet made. It was comedy in the sense that it produced laughter, genuine, sustained laughter from an audience that was following every word with the specific attention of people who understood they were watching something that required close following. But it was also something harder to categorize. A sustained argument about language and power and the ways in which American society managed its own self-deception, made by a man who had been observing those mechanisms for 4 decades and had arrived at a degree of clarity about them that the comedy form, in his hands, could fully contain. The audience at the Paramount responded in ways that people who attended that taping later described as unusual. Not just laughing, but listening, catching nuances in the material that required genuine attention. The room moving through emotional registers that comedy audiences rarely move through. Carlin commanded the stage the way very few performers ever command a stage. Not by dominating the room's energy, but by so completely inhabiting what he was doing that the room had no choice but to follow. The taping was, by any observable standard, extraordinary. Everyone in the building that night understood they had witnessed something. But Carlin was not in the building anymore when he sat in the screening room and watched it for the first time, alone. The taping had been finished, the audience had gone home, and the question that performance had always eventually raised, the private, unanswerable question, was now in front of him without the noise of the room to defer it. What he concluded in that screening room, whether what he watched was the thing he had meant, whether the gap had been closed or was still there at some level, he never said directly. In the years after Jammin in New York, he spoke about the special with a careful qualification that his audiences eventually recognized as his particular form of pride. He would acknowledge its quality, would accept the praise that it received, but would always leave a small and specific reservation, the sense that even in what others considered his best work, he was still measuring it against something that existed only in his own interior. That reservation was not false modesty. It was the genuine sensibility of a man who had spent 40 years pursuing a standard he had defined for himself, a standard that moved with him rather than remaining fixed, always slightly ahead of where the work had arrived. It was the quality that had made him so consistently extraordinary, and the quality that made the private screening of even his greatest work a complicated rather than simple experience. Jammin in New York was subsequently recognized by critics and comedians and audiences who studied the form as one of the finest stand-up comedy specials ever recorded, a sustained piece of work that held together at a level of craft and intention that the medium rarely achieves. It was work that had clearly been made by someone who knew exactly what he was doing, who had refined the material and the performance and the construction with complete commitment. But in the screening room, in the dark, before any of that recognition had arrived, before the reviews, before the awards, before the decades of people describing it as a high watermark, there was simply a man watching what he had made, measuring it against the thing he had meant, in the silence of a room that held no one else's opinion. That silence is where the most honest evaluation happens. Not in the reviews, not in the acclaim, not in the response of rooms full of people who have come specifically to confirm the work's quality. In the private screening room, in the dark, where the only measure available is the one the artist carries inside. What Carlin carried inside was not satisfiable by any single achievement. It had never been satisfiable. It was the quality that had driven him from the clean-cut television comedian of the 1960s to the cultural critic of the 1970s to the precise and unsparing voice of the 1980s and 1990s. A permanent, internal dissatisfaction with everything that was less than completely honest, completely precise, completely what he had actually meant. In the screening room, that quality watched what had been made. It measured, it evaluated in silence. And then the film ended, and the lights came up, and George Carlin sat for a moment in the empty room before standing and going back to whatever came next. What he decided in that room, he kept. But the work he made in the years that followed, still pressing forward, still looking for the edge that kept moving just slightly ahead of where he was, suggests that whatever the private screening had told him, it had not told him he was finished. He was never finished. That was the point.